Thanks a lot. This is a group I've been wanting to hang out with for some time, so it's a treat to be here. I did a podcast a little while ago with Richard right here, and one of the things I talked about was an idea that I'll lay out a little bit more in this talk as well on what one possible future role for librarians would be. And this was the Read Write Web blog's take on that, right? So sexy librarians of the future help you upload your videos to YouTube, right? And which kind of captured sort of the essence of what I was talking about, but I think that's really a demeaning image for librarians. I mean, come on, that's just exploitive. That's just wrong. So I have an alternate picture here, right? So this is third stage guild navigator from the science fiction novel Dune, and as imagined in the movie of the book, which I thought was great. And so what you have here is this large beast, kind of the size of a locomotive, and leaves sort of a trail of slime on the floor. But they have this kind of a superpower, and the superpower that they have is that they basically make intergalactic life possible by folding space, right? By bringing 2 points that are far apart into close conjunction, and that's how interstellar travel is possible, and that's what kind of makes everything run. So my notion was that in some sense, I think librarians are guild navigators, right? And what they do is have this special power to kind of understand connections in information space and bring things together that are distant and pull them into close conjunction. And that was really what this was, right? That's really what library lookup is all about, is noticing that there's some correspondence between this record sitting over in Amazon in one place and an OPAC record sitting in a library in another place, and bringing them together in a single click. So that was the essence of it, and I think what it seems like has happened is that notion that it was possible to do that and it was cool to do that got some traction in this community, and that's been really cool. There was a fundamental flaw, there still is actually, with library lookup, and it's that it's doing a lookup by ISBN, which, as you all know, is imperfect because books have many ISBNs. And so one thing that really moved this forward was a service provided by OCLC called XISBN. You probably all know about that as well. So, one-to-many mapping, give any ISBN from the family of ISBNs that refer to a work and get back the cloud of those things so that you can work with an equivalence. And have multiple names for the same thing resolved in a useful way. And this kind of idea of equivalence, I just want to kind of digress a little bit, because I think there's something that I think of as a class of service that there needs to be a lot more of in the world right now, an equivalence service. And so XISBN is one of those. And some people that I met at MIT in a project called Project Simile are also working along these lines in an interesting way. And so they're kind of coming at the semantic web from a very grassroots, pragmatic point, having kind of broken their pick on top-down ontologies and taxonomies for many years. And so they're coming at it from a different direction. So a couple of examples here. This is a data set for a group of faculty at one university, and this is a data set for another group of faculty at another university. And the software behind those things is allowing people to describe the same things in different ways. So, for example, at MIT, you might describe a faculty member as having a title. And at Columbia, you might describe a faculty member as having a position. And the stance that the Project Simile folks have taken is, that's great. You want to think about it as a title, you want to think about it as a position, we're good with that. What we'll do, though, is we'll create the possibility of an equivalence service. In fact, one you can make for yourself. So this is a mashup editor that they've done, and as an example, you can go to the site at simile.mit.edu/potluck, and you can actually do this example for yourself. But basically, we'll load these two data sets in and say, well, how do you want to merge them, right? And here, exactly what I'm doing is creating a slot which is merging the position slot from MIT with the title slot from Columbia, right? And now we're going to just call those things whatever you want to call it, right? You decide. But it doesn't matter. And I talked about this a little bit with Stefano Mazzocchi, who was with Project Cocoon and now is working on this. And so I just want to kind of invite y'all to think about the notion of equivalent services, what that could mean, and fundamentally, the importance of letting people describe things in their own vocabularies and then having the tools to mash those vocabularies together so that we can work with things in an equivalent way. So, thanks to XISBN, there were a number of cool spin-offs from Library Lookup. And this actually wound up being my favorite one, right? So in this version of it, I have a wish list on Amazon. So now anytime I see a book that's possibly interesting, I just stick it on my Amazon wish list and forget about it. Then I have a background thread that once a day checks and sees if anything that's on my Amazon wish list has showed up in my local library. And if it has, I get an alert in my RSS reader, right? So there it is, right? And the backstory for this particular example is actually even more interesting, because when I received that RSS alert that told me that the Geography of Nowhere, which I'd put on my Amazon wish list, had just showed up in the Keene Public Library, I was actually sitting in the Keene Public Library, right? So, it not only, folded information space, but it kind of folded physical space, because, there I was just working in the library like I do sometimes, and this alert came in, and I got up and I walked 10 feet over to the shelf, and there was the book, right? It was just sort of like folded physical space too, in a really weird and interesting way. So I've had a lot of fun with this thing, and what's been the most fun for me is all these conversations that I've had with librarians as they've helped me to figure out how to get these different OPAC systems supported by Library Lookup, right? Which, I mean, all it means for an OPAC to support Library Lookup is that it allows lookup by ISBN. But, as you know, a lot of these OPAC systems are constructed in a pretty obtuse way, and it's not even very obvious a lot of the time whether it's possible or not to do, just a request on the URL line that feeds an ISBN in and gets an answer back. So I've had a lot of help with this, and this is just my favorite thing, right? To get an email from some librarian who doesn't think of himself or herself as a programmer or a hacker in any way, right? They think of themselves as librarians, but they've kind of gotten excited about this idea of, wow, we can make these equivalences happen in information space. That's really neat. I'd like to be able to do that. And they start to explore, and they kind of parse these URLs, and they figure out, oh, this is it. This is the formula, right? And once they figure it out, I'm able to sort of add that to the bookmarklet generator. And so now they haven't just solved the problem for their particular library, they've solved the problem for a whole class of libraries that use the OPAC system that observes that particular pattern. So I love to kind of call these things out, right? And just, attaboy, way to go, Janet, right? And, that's just, I get such a kick out of that. But what I got an even bigger kick out of, actually, was the following exchange, right? So, why doesn't Library Lookup support my OPAC, right, is this question. And this was the answer that I got from a librarian, right? Okay, I get it. We bought the wrong kind of software. And what she meant, I mean, she didn't have these words to describe it, but what she meant by the wrong kind of software was, so we bought a piece of software that doesn't expose queries on the URL line and is not friendly to spontaneous, lightweight service composition. Right? I mean, that's how you and I would sort of describe that. But to her, it was actually very simple. Like, we got the wrong thing. And I love that because while this conversation was going on, this was some years ago, I was at InfoWorld magazine, and this was during the heyday of kind of the frenzy around XML web services, and there's a whole conversation happening there, which was not at all related to this phenomenon. And I actually feel pretty good about the fact that since then the pendulum has swung back, and there's been a pretty good compromise struck between the kind of, in my opinion anyway, the kind of formal XML Web Services regime and the lightweight RESTful approach, right? So I think we're bringing those things back together. But it's very interesting to me to see that non-technical librarians actually get this, and I think that to the extent that they do, they're putting pressure on their IT people, to buy and implement and deploy systems that make it so that something like library lookup is much more likely to happen, right? It's a system that invites things like that to happen, as opposed to just allows things like that to happen. Would be a really good deal.
So we're among friends here. Which one was it?
Which one was what?
Which was the wrong kind of software?
I don't remember. I don't remember. I mean, there's a few ways that it can happen, right? There are some systems that are opaque in the sense that they just they won't expose any kind of HTTP or HTML access, and there's some that require you to be logged in with a session key, right? And so there's just a couple ways that it can thwart library lookup, and I forget which one it was. So I want to put in a plug for my pals at the Ann Arbor Public Library, who are such an interesting case study to me, right? So you have on the one hand Ed Vilmetti, the super patron, right? Who's somebody out there in the patron community, kind of pushing the envelope on what's possible, right? What can I make this library system do? And this is just one of the things that he's done. It's kind of a library lookup type thing for, I guess, videos at the library. But what's so interesting about it is the collaboration that goes on between Ed and John Bleiberg, the super librarian in this scenario, right? Who's the guy that probably most of you know, has put an interface layer on top of the innovative system that the Ann Arbor Public Library is using to make it more RESTful and more open to these kinds of lightweight service compositions. So this is the spec for PatRest, right? And I just love to watch the interplay between those two, and it's such a great model for how things ought to be more generally, I think. So kind of back to this, sexy librarian helps you post your YouTube videos and the Guild Navigator thing. But what occurred to me, what I mentioned to Richard, and I've talked about a lot lately, is that I think in many ways still libraries wind up being focused on how to facilitate finding things and consuming things, which is great. But we're sort of in this era where also a whole lot of people are becoming producers. And so I've been asking myself this question, what is the library's role perhaps in a world where people are producers and the library is a center of production as well as a center of consumption, and how could librarians and libraries help people curate the stuff that they themselves develop and publish? So this was a really strange thing. You guys, I don't know if you saw this report. The way it came to my attention is that, of course, somebody blogged about it, and what they blogged about was pointed to this page, and fundamentally it was a report called the Google Generation Report, that claimed to be busting myths about, for example, the myth that kids today are whizzes at computers and information systems, and the report was like, no, actually they're not. It's not what you think. And so the report got a lot of press, and and most of the blogosphere pointed to this page, which was actually the announcement about the report, right? And the podcast about the launch event, and and the podcast. I guess, yeah, so they're talking all about the launch event, right? And underneath the fold there, all this press coverage, right? So the report was covered, in a dozen different places, and it was all through the news. And I got to wondering, what did the report actually say? And I went and I looked, and you know, the report was basically a 35-page PDF file, which was a summary of a bunch of other stuff. And, you know, and it made these claims. And so this is one of the claims, right? And the claim was, you know, myth. Google generation learned by doing rather than knowing while their elders are still reading the manual. And the report summary claimed, myth busted. That's totally false, right? And this is the evidence cited, right? There appears to be very little difference between 16-year-olds and their parents, according to the survey findings by Ofcom 2006 below. It's like, well, what's that, right? You know, I couldn't find out. You know, and I went back to the website, and it was just a whole series of PDF files pointing to other PDF files, no links, no data. It took me an hour, and I never really got to the bottom of it. You know, I couldn't actually find the footnote that was mentioned here, right? And you know, the irony of this is that, you know, so this was the report conclusion, right? And especially, right, this was the message of the report. And by the way, the thing was sponsored partly by the British Library, which, you know, the ultimate irony, right? So, you know, kids today have, you know, little facility with evaluating information, relevance, and so on, right? But I tried, you know, and you know, I got nowhere, right? I tried to track back to the sources and figure out what, you know, I got nowhere with this. And nobody noticed, right? You know, none of the press coverage about this thing, as far as I can tell, got past the 35-page summary, you know, into any of the supporting material. So, you know, what can you say, right? I mean, this is a perfect example of what I'm trying to say. That stuff that we publish on the web right now, that we all increasingly are publishing on the web, needs to fit into some kind of a model that, you know, librarians understand better than anyone else, right? You know, this notion of curating, this notion of provenance, this notion of authority, you know, needs to be brought together with this surge of production that's happening all around us. And it's also, so I don't know if Beth's here, but, oh, hey, Beth. So I had a talk with Beth about this notion of federation, and what as I understand it, Beth is trying to federate is patrons, and patrons' use of resources in the library across a bunch of different libraries, right? So you create this federation of patrons, and they collectively know a lot, right? And you know, what I'm wondering is, don't librarians collectively know a lot about the provenance of different kinds of sources? And you know, what would it be like if they federated? You know, I mean, why can't I go and find out? Well, what is Ofcom? Ofcom is the Office of UK Office of Communication, I guess. I found out, but I don't know anything more about it than that. Right? You know, why can't I go online and go to the sort of pooled knowledge of the curators, of the librarians, and say, well, you know, what should I even think about this source of information, right? And how do I evaluate the sources that flowed into this report? So, for what it's worth, you know, being a complete outsider to your world, I just imagine that would be a kind of a cool thing if it could happen. It's going to matter a whole lot more because we're also seeing a flood of all kinds of data being published to the web. So this is one example. There's a project called FluxNet, and this is a collaboration with Microsoft Research. And I talked to these folks recently, and what they're doing is collecting carbon dioxide data from sensors around the world, and it's been brought together in a portal. And you know, exactly the question that is starting to dawn on a lot of people in the scientific community right now is that data itself is needing to become a publishable artifact with provenance and, you know, all of that apparatus associated with it. And the people who are publishing the data, you know, again, it's not, you know, the curation and the provenance and the authority, you know, those aren't the skills or specialties of the people who are producing all of this stuff. but those things need to happen in a big way. So, what's the role of librarians and libraries in cultivating that kind of skill set in people who are publishing all kinds of data and helping people with that? And so the realm of science is one. Another realm is there's this scope of public data, I call it. So, in my town, I've taken up a little community information project, and the idea is I want to. In this case, what I'm trying to do is show people some things about syndication and tagging, right? So back to this kind of folding information space idea, right? I want people in my community to see that there doesn't just have to be a single database of events that are happening in town, right? That you can go to the web and you can put something on upcoming, or you can put something on eventful, and or you can put something on Flickr, right? But if it's tagged in an agreed upon way, it can flow into our community information portal, right? So that's just having an idea about the uses of tagging and syndication. This is the events page, right? And I'm going to a bunch of places that have online calendars, but what I'm really trying to steer people to is the idea that, well, if you go to one of these websites that flows data back to an RSS feed that I can latch onto, and there's a tag or some way of indicating that this is connected, then there doesn't just have to be a single repository, right? You can think in terms of loosely coupled information architecture. There's actually a version of library lookup for this as well, which I think is really cool. And so what you get to do here is you just put your Amazon wish list into the thing, and then it just scans for you. And so anytime something shows up, you get an email, right? And this has actually been a complete failure, right? A complete failure. I thought it was cool because it's email and people are familiar with it and they'll get it, but it's just actually too abstract, right? It's this notion that I indicate something over here on an Amazon wish list, and then a connection is made to a record in the public library's system, and then an alert comes to me is too abstract, right? So people, I think, definitely are going to need a lot of help in kind of conceptualizing how these loosely coupled architectures can work, because they're really kind of simple and powerful, but they're very non-obvious. So anyway, one of the things I've been working on is trying to get crime data for my city, because there was a debate going on in my town about, are we having a crime wave, are we not having a crime wave, right? Nobody had any data. And so I thought, well, all right, let's go look. And in this case, I did find some sources of data. So here's one. You can go to the Department of Justice and actually get some crime data about Keene. I was able to take that data, put it up into a website, and create a visualization. So now I have a shareable representation of the pattern of crime over a series of years in my town. Well, that's an interesting resource, but there's no notion of how does the city or the town kind of curate something like that, right? Like, I mean, you could probably go to the library and you could find books on the history of Keene, but you can't go to the library and find where's current information about Keene, right? That's not part of the curatorial mindset. Or, I actually went and with a little bit of arm twisting, I got some more comprehensive data directly from the police department. But, so how does the police department think about publishing data in a town, right? Where do they put it, and how do they think about organizing it and tagging it and labeling it so that it can be found? Well, there's just no model for that. This is on a much larger scale, right? This is New York City's restaurant inspections database, which is a website that you can go to. It's online, and here's the same thing in every block being the successor to Chicago Crime, which was Adrian Holovati's kind of galvanic mashup, right? It's one of the early mashups. And so every block is all about getting information that is produced by cities out into a form where it's more useful. But still the question of provenance and curation arises, and there's no notion of who would do that, right? And I've actually talked with Adrian about this, and he said, well, you know, we agreed it's kind of unclear, right? I mean, there's a role actually for newspapers, and in some ways they fulfill that function, but there's potentially also a role for libraries. You know, I don't know. I just raised the question. I think it's interesting. He thought it was too. So this is just to suggest that, you know, we have a notion of style in prose, and you know, we haven't had a notion of style in RESTful web services, right? So you know, the whole question of how you organize, let's say, a URL namespace for a set of resources, right? You know, there's a kind of there's a set of information architectural principles that have never really been articulated, you know, and it has a lot to do with how you label, organize, and enable people to retrieve information. And it's something that I think, you know, people in this group are sort of uniquely positioned to, again, you know, to influence how these web namespaces are organized when they get published. So on this notion of sort of local production, I did a podcast with a friend of mine who runs a political blog called Blue Hampshire in my state, and we were going to record it at my house, but things were too noisy, and we were going to record it at his house, but things were too noisy there too. So we said, well, let's go to the library. So we went to the library, you know, and so this is a picture of the second floor of the library, and there's sort of 3 rooms which are all locked and empty and dark. You know, there's the price room and the green room and the some other meeting room, right? And these beautiful rooms are empty and locked, and we wound up sitting on those 2 chairs in the lobby, recording the podcast, because I said, well, you know, I'd like to use the library to produce something, and they said, well, are you a nonprofit organization? And I said, well, yeah, actually, yeah. I mean, I'm doing this for IT conversations, and it's a 501c3. So can we use the room? And they said, no. So it's just, I mean, I don't know. You know, again, it's just, it's kind of a one-way street mentality, right? And it's a two-way web, and so I'm really sort of interested in how can libraries be more a part of that two-way flow. That's the Blue Hampshire. If you listen to this, you'll hear an echo, right? And that's because we had to record it in this big empty room instead of one of the nice little rooms. And so this I see this a lot in my library. It's a public library, right? And one of the things you see a lot now is there is this notion of kind of training, but the training all seems to be about using computers, using the internet. And I wonder if this notion of training and teaching and education can extend to modes of production as opposed to just modes of consumption and retrieval. I think that would be a good thing. And I love this, right? So I just was up in Redmond, and there's a place called the Crossroads Mall. And in the Crossroads Mall, right on the main drag, and contiguous with the flow of the mall is the public library, right? It's just part of the life of the mall, and I think that's delightful as well. So really what I want to do is talk with you guys as much as talk at you about some of these ideas, and so I'm going to end now, and I hope we can just have some discussion.
All right. Anyone have questions? Who wants to be the first one?
It doesn't have to be a question. It can be
comment.
I was wondering, actually, if you could elaborate a little on your thoughts on if we provide instruction for all of these modes of production, do you think that it will bring up the level of information that's put out there in podcasts, Wikipedia, YouTube, all that? Like, what do you think?
Absolutely. So to give you one example, we had a flood a couple years ago in my town, and I hopped on my bicycle and I went around town with a video camera, and I made actually a documentary about what had happened. And I've had a few requests for it since then because, at the time, it was kind of a citizen news deal, right? It was coverage of the event ahead of the TV crew getting into town and showing people what happened. And so it had a real-time function. But then retrospectively, what's happened is I've had requests from the city planner. And so the city planner got in touch with me and he said, well, that's actually the best documentation that we have of what the flood levels were in town. So when we're doing planning, we want to go back and see that. So, do you have a copy of the thing or where can I find the thing, right? And similarly, I guess it was the fire department got in touch for a related kind of thing. They were doing some emergency planning, and again, they wanted to see, how things had worked out. So I guess my point would be, if you're a citizen journalist type, and you produce something which is, part of the information stream that should be part of the history and the life of the town, like, well, where do you put it, right? Right now it's like, well, I'll put it up, I'll tag it, and I hope people will search for it and find it, right? Or if you're the police department or some other agency, or restaurant inspections, you're the health department, right? So now you're curating all this data, and you're also increasingly publishing it, right? So what, you're publishing it because you want people to find it and you want people to use it, but you have no notion of how to do that, right? And there is no notion of what's a structure into which such things can fit. So I think there's kind of an interesting hyper-local role there. So like the federation idea is a global thing, right? In other words, I would like globally for the understanding that librarians have about the provenance of sources to be pooled and available, right? And that's nothing to do with anything local, but there's also, I think, this really interesting local component, right? Because the library's in a community, the community has a life. There's all these sources being produced, lots more all the time. How do we organize those things?
When you're talking about the notion of librarians as field navigators, when I think of it, there's an element of time when thinking of a model. Because when we think of curation and thinking of providence, I feel like I'm standing behind time. And to be able to think of a model where we could define what we can keep up with the situations that you have mentioned, you have to have a way of looking ahead of time, so you could have that, you could capture that and think of a model of how to curate. And I'm just thinking when you throw in the element of time to think and thinking about models of curation in this digital environment.
Okay, I'm not quite sure how to respond to that, except this, which is that I think that this notion of equivalence services and the fluidity of that is going to be kind of central, right? In other words, what we see on the web is an evolutionary kind of thing, right? And it's very contrary to, as I understand it, the models of classification on which a lot of library science operates, right? It's emergent, it's fluid. And I'm not going to say one is right and one is wrong. You need all of these things, but I do think that we need, greater openness to and attention to the possibility of emergent classification and fluid equivalence, if that helps or even means anything.
I also think time is a concern, and I don't know how to go about it, and it's not. I don't really have a question. It just seems like that one thing that all libraries could cooperate on is checking the provenance of news stories for currency, and maybe I don't know, a blog, a wiki, something that librarians could all contribute to. So when the Washington Post or some other journal or newspaper publishes something which is clearly out in left field, people would have a place where they could check it, and they would know that this was done by a non-partial organization of people that understand information and understand provenance. I think it would give libraries an a new sense of credibility to a generation that maybe doesn't know anything about libraries and probably hadn't stepped foot in one in years, if ever.
You talked there about libraries getting involved in kind of the remix and production culture. Where do you feel that copyright law, DRM, and the really hard question, your employer's stance on that kind of stuff fits in with this?
Well, I'm actually mostly talking about the stuff that people produce for themselves. Right? So, in other words, if somebody produces something and they want it to be public and they want it to be shared, right? Now we're not in DRM space or copyright space at all, right? It's entirely a question of, I have produced this artifact, or we as a city agency are publishing this data, right? And it's all public and it's all open and it wants to be found and it wants to be used, right? And the only question is, how can we best do that, right? How can we how can we put stuff out there in a way that will fulfill the purpose of putting it out there, which is for people to find it and use it? Yeah, I mean.
Hi.
Yeah.
How does your role at Microsoft connect to any of this? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I am an evangelist at Microsoft, and I am an oddball. In the sense that there are a lot of evangelists at Microsoft who are very focused on products and technologies, and I'm trying to be one who's focused on ideas and kind of moving things forward broadly.
Okay. I happen to be in the business of training the public on how to use computers in public libraries, so I'm very interested in what you said about moving training from computers to producing, and I'm wondering how realistic is that when you talk about the complexity of the library lookup in Amazon wish list. I mean, when we're talking about producing, we're talking about creating, uploading, tagging, posting, and how many people will actually go there?
So, well, one way to think about it is people are already doing these things, right? I mean, people already are uploading all kinds of stuff to the web and are tagging stuff and finding in an ad hoc way what happens as they start to engage with that world, right? As they start to extrude content into the space. So I think some perspective and some guidance would be really helpful, right? Well, what is it? Who are you trying to reach? What are your objectives in putting this thing out there? What strategies will be most effective, right? I mean, it's something I think about all the time because I'm kind of a creature of the web, and I, constantly, publishing stuff because I'm trying to create, interaction and draw attention. So I think all the time about, well, where I put it, how the feeds flow out of it, what's connected to what, and I've done so much of that I actually I had to step back recently and realize how much of that I've internalized. And I'm kind of not even consciously aware of it. It's a kind of a tacit thing. Like I just sort of know, I know an awful lot now about how to publish stuff online, just because I've done it for a long time. But there's a set of principles there which I stepped back and if I had to articulate them, well, gee, that'd be valuable for a lot of people who haven't really, been operating in that space nearly as much, haven't thought about those things, right? Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Oh. I'm interested in maybe a few of your ideas about how to solve the off-con footnote problem.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously, if there was a full footnote that was available at the bottom of the page like it's supposed to be, that would be one step. But would embedding things like coins or a URI that would resolve to something that people could then...
Yeah, a link would have been really a good thing.
yeah, that would be a nice...
I was kind of hoping for a link,
But can we also build into the publishing software that produces these things the ability to have bibliographic databases that actually help and help also publish the data on which the data and the reports on which these other documents are being based?
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, there is a project at Microsoft along those lines that I think isn't public yet, so I can't say much about it. But exactly to that point, right? Have the authoring systems more aware of the nexus into which the stuff that's being written is going to be published, right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
The question I have is, you're talking about people producing content and libraries helping people produce content, and I think you're thinking of it from a content that's been born digital kind of way. But what about libraries helping people digitize and preserve their personal materials? I had a conversation with my mom the other day. She has 600 slides that she took of Paris and all of the places in Europe, and she was like, what am I supposed to do with these? They don't make slide carousels anymore. And
that's a great idea.
It seems to me
everybody's
like
in
that's
that
a
boat.
role that public libraries could not only help people with, but it would also help them enrich their local history collections, because I think public libraries are having a really hard time getting those kinds of materials now. People just aren't donating them.
No, you're absolutely right. It's a really good point. And it's actually not only the shoebox with the photos, because in some weird sense, the shoebox with the photos in it is a more durable construct than what many of us have done for the last 10 years with our digital photos, right? I was visiting my parents at the beginning of this trip, on Monday. And my parents spent a year in India when I was a little kid, and they're very old now, and we were going through their files, and we found all of this documentation, all of this correspondence, all the letters that they had written back home. The whole record of it was there, and you just had to wonder, right? I mean, the equivalent, of what we are now doing in recording our histories, will that be findable in 45 years? Probably much less likely, right? So it cuts both ways. But yeah, I think that could be huge.
I'll just apologize in advance. This isn't a very well-formed question, but maybe you could muse a little. There's a trope in our community that the library software industry revenue stream has been fairly constant at about $500 million for many years through the bubble and still. And there's been a lot of upheaval there. But strangely, I went to work for an organization about a year ago that has an annual budget which is slightly more than that. And right before I made that change, you went to work for an organization that has an annual budget, like a monthly revenue stream, which dwarfs that. So I'm just curious to know, after a little bit of time, Brewster said something the other day about how preservation is easier with access. Access drives preservation. So in that context, what have you seen working at such a big organization about scaling to many users over time and that sort of thing? I mean, so you guys can blink and you can wipe out industries, right? So what have you learned so far while you're there?
Well, not just in a specific Microsoft context, but in general. It's very clear to me that this whole notion of utility computing and utility storage in the cloud, right, is you're going to see that happening across the board, right? And all that does is create the environment in which the kinds of things I'm talking about start to make more sense, is the way I think about it, right? Because right now it's pretty haphazard, right? I mean, right now, I've got photos on Flickr, and I've got a couple different blog streams from different eras, right? And that's really, that's in some sense, my legacy, right? And it's pretty, scattered, right? And pretty fragile, right? So I think that, all of the big tech players, are going to be building out infrastructure, which is going to create the possibility of us doing things, online in a loosely coupled, service-oriented, data-driven way. That's that's just more reliable, more robust. That people will pay for. Actually, I mean, what I want right now is I want a service that I can actually pay for. I don't care about the fact that it's free with ads, right? I care about the fact that I'd like to put my stuff in a place where I have the possibility of, paying this much a month for this level of service, and this much more a month, for some other level of service, and maybe there's a level of service which guarantees that my grandkids will have access to it, right? And I think I think people will come to see that that's something that they want to pay for, right? And it's going to be a business opportunity for a lot of tech players, including Microsoft. I hope. Is it? Yeah.
So I'm curious about this notion of data curation, and I kind of been sitting here thinking about the history of libraries and the development of union catalogs as kind of a big breakthrough in terms of the history of library science, and then libraries going online and getting, from sort of online through OCLC to online on the web, and that all had a huge impact on the way that libraries work together and that scientific and other cultural research is done. And I'm just wondering about this notion of data curation, if we kind of have an offer to make to the scientific community to kind of build a union catalog for scientific data in a way, and build an infrastructure that would really support the next generation of scientific research.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I showed a picture of Timo Hanne. He's the web guy with Nature, and in that conversation that I had with him, that's the point that he made is, and you hear this all over the place now, is that in science it's hard to get credit for being a producer of data. So there's a lot of stuff that winds up, you sort of do a fig leaf of a paper, to justify essentially publishing the data, right? Because people can't really just publish the data. There's also not the mechanism there for getting credit for citations, and especially citations in granular ways, right? Like I used this piece of the data set, right? So, a structure into which that stuff can pour and be sanely utilized would, I think, be huge, yeah. Thanks very much. This was fun to meet you guys.